Good morning and welcome to CNN, Crowe News Network, sponsored by Go Crowe.
In today's news, we see a shift in Putin's attitude towards Russia's Soviet history under the reign of Stalin.
Stalin's 29-year reign, generally seen by Russia in recent years as a dark and bloody chapter in the nation's history, has lately been applauded by Putin and his supporters as the foundation on which the great Soviet superpower was built.
Recent tributes celebrate Stalin's military command acumen and geopolitical prowess. His ruthless repression of enemies, real and imagined, has been brushed aside by today's Kremlin leader as the cost to be paid for defeating the Nazis.
On May 9th, the 70th anniversary of the Allied war victory was marked, and Stalin's image was put on display with glorifying war films, t-shirts, billboards, and posters. Framed portraits of the mustachioed Generalissimo were carried by marchers in Red Square's Victory Day parade and in the million-strong civic procession that followed to honor all who fell in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War.
Now the question is Putin right to glorify Stalin? We decide to let you, our viewers, decide.
Now let's take a look back at how exactly Stalin came to be such a household name in the Soviet Union. Although he was born with a different surname, Stalin adopted this name, meaning man of steel.
It's amazing to look at how far Stalin has come. He grew up in poverty, his father was an alcoholic who beat him, and he was left with facial scars from when he contracted smallpox as a child.
It's also interesting that Stalin first got interested in Karl Marx's work while he was attending a seminary and studying for the priesthood in the Georgian Orthodox Church. By 1899, he was expelled for missing exams, and that's when he joined the more militant wing of the Marxist Social Democratic movement, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin.
Stalin also became involved in various criminal activities, including bank heists, the proceeds from which were used to help fund the Bolshevik Party.
When he was in exile in Switzerland in 1912, Lenin appointed Stalin to serve on the first Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. 3 years later, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. The Soviet Union was founded in 1922 with Lenin as its first leader. During these years, Stalin had continued to move up the party ladder.
In 1922, he became Secretary General of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, a role that enabled him to appoint his allies to government jobs and grow a base of political support. After Lenin died in 1924, Stalin eventually outmaneuvered his rivals and won the power struggle for control of the Communist Party. By the late 1920s, he had become the dictator of the Soviet Union. Now, before we move on, Sonny, I think it's important for our viewers that we really detail this outmaneuvering that Stalin achieved.
That's a great point, Amir. The key factor that gave Stalin an edge on Trotsky was that he was already had a base of power in the party membership. He was a true master of the crucial details of party structure. Whenever he clashed with other leaders, Stalin could draw support all the way from the very base of the party membership.
He was also less of an intellectual and internationalist compared to those who came before him, and let's not forget that he was also much more brutal.
That's exactly right, Amir. Speaking of Stalin's brutality, we now have your story on the purges.
Thanks, Sonny. Stalin's purges, also known as Stalin's terror, grew from his paranoia and his desire to be an absolute autocrat, and were enforced via the communist secret police. They helped develop a centrally forced cult of Stalin worship and a terrifying system of labor camps called the Gulag. Many factors inspired Stalin to kill millions of his own people, but his primary motivations were to build a united and strong country with himself as the leader, and to industrialize Russia to Western standards. The exploitation of thousands of prisoners led to a large increase in Russian manufacturing. Yet aside from expanding his nation's economy, the purges helped soothe his irrational paranoia by exterminating his opposition, such as the kulaks, who were fairly wealthy farmers. An instance of Stalin eliminating his opponents was in 1934, when Stalin's primary rival, Sergei Kirov, was murdered. Alongside the murder, he arrested thousands of his opponents by blaming the murder and other charges on them. Although many adversaries were severely punished, many ordinary people were abused as well. To maintain his power and image, Stalin issued propaganda and censored anything that reflected poorly on him, and replaced churches with his icons. He began to exterminate war prisoners and traitors, and mass executions were held, ultimately resulting in the death of thousands of service officers. This trend continued, and over 20 million people were sent to labor camps, and roughly 10 million died as a result of Stalin's actions.
Thanks, Amir, for that great segment on the purges. Now to Aditi, who will explain the collectivization of agriculture under Stalin's reign.
I'm here on the site of the Russian countryside on one of the largest collective farms in Ukraine. Collectivization is the economic Stalinist policy adopted by the Soviet Union between 1929 and 1933. This process was taken in conjunction with industrialization and to ultimately reduce the power of the wealthy peasants or kulaks. Under the policy of collectivization, peasants were forced to give up individual farms and join large collective farms. Through the process, Soviet leaders Trotsky and Stalin had differing ideas on how collectivization should be pursued. Trotsky favored a gradual process of collectivization with the support of the peasants to avoid disrupting agricultural productivity. On the other hand, Stalin vied for a more immediate form of forced collectivization so that farms would be more efficiently controlled by the state and bring in capital for heavy industry. With Stalin in power, collectivization went on a rampage. Between October 1929 and January 1930, about 21% of peasants were forced to collectivize as the government was concentrated on extracting grain from the kulaks. Party officials carried out the initial campaign of de-kulakization and collectivization. They would seek first to remove the kulaks from the village while confiscating their land, and then attempt to coerce the remaining peasants into organizing into collective forms. Harsh measures including land confiscations, arrests, deportations to prison and camps were inflicted upon all peasants who resisted collectivization. Over 2 million peasants were formally removed from their homes. They were deported to distant areas in the Soviet Union or to prison camps, where many died from diseases, exposure, and malnutrition. Much of the violence of collectivization occurred here in Ukraine, where Stalin used collectivization to not only reconstruct agricultural production, but also to crush any Ukrainian nationalism. Millions of lives were lost in a result. By 1937, over 90% of Soviet agriculture had been collectivized. The government organized motor track stations that supplied the seed and equipment for several collective farms in the region and oversaw the collection of the sale of grains. Despite these great costs, the forced collectivization achieved the final establishment of the Soviet and Stalinist power in the countryside.
Thank you, Aditi, for that informative report. Now we have Cleo, who will detail the German invasion of Russia.
The German invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941. Hitler's ambitions to invade the area were primarily motivated by Lebensraum, or the need for living space for a growing Germany. His goals were to defeat Russia, take over the Ukraine, and control the oil fields of Azerbaijan. The Nazis intended to take Russia before winter in order to avoid meeting the same fate as Napoleon's forces in the 19th century. The invasion was initially delayed by Italy's involvements in Egypt and Greece. German forces were forced to give aid, resulting in a 6-week delay. Operation Barbarossa, as the invasion was called, had 3 main targets in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. The German forces were initially successful against the Russian Air Force, which was populist but antiquated. The Germans destroyed about 2,000 Russian airplanes, crippling the Russian army. By September, Hitler focused in the south, beginning the infamous 900-day siege of Leningrad, which took close to 1 million civilians died. The German advance was finally halted when they attempted to take Moscow. By November, the Russian winter had become a formidable opponent, in which German soldiers died from severe frostbite and hypothermia. The Russian army was finally able to repair and build defenses as it received assistance from the Allied powers and began to counterattack. Moscow itself was heavily fortified, much by its own citizens, who dug trenches and set up barbed wire fences. By December, German troops began a slow retreat, and by springtime, operations were brought to a halt. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was due to delay, inadequate logistical preparation, and a focus on becoming conquerors of the vast Russian Empire. It was an arduous ideological and military battle in which close to 20 million Russians died, and Jews and Slavs were targeted for enslavement and extermination. It marked a turning point in World War II, and forced Nazi Germany to confront a two-front battle that they were incapable of winning.
After Russia defeated the Nazis in 1941, Stalin died in 1953. 53 years later, figures such as Putin are celebrating his leadership, regardless of the fact that he killed millions of his own people.
After becoming informed on Stalin's policies yourself, do you think that the glorification of Stalin is justified? Film your responses using your very own GoPro. We'd love to hear what you think.
Thanks for watching. This is Amir and Sunny signing off.
And now.